The treaty was designed to cripple Earth forever. Across the vast obsidian table, the alien delegates waited for the human ambassador to beg, to weep, or to surrender. Instead, Ambassador Kessler looked at the draconian terms that would end human independence, leaned back, and smiled. They never saw it coming. The grand chamber of the Galactic Assembly was a masterpiece of intimidation. Suspended in the upper stratosphere of Prime Station Aegis, its walls were constructed from transparent chronal glass, offering a dizzying view of a swirling gas giant below. The architecture was designed to make any visiting species feel infinitesimally small. For 3 centuries, it had worked perfectly. At the center of the amphitheater sat Arbiter Zarka, a towering figure of the Tavari Directorate. His physiology was a terrifying blend of chitinous armor and predatory grace, draped in the ceremonial crimson silks of a victor. Flanking him were representatives from the 3 other major council races, the bureaucratic Olarans, the militaristic Krell, and the deeply algorithmic Via. Opposite them, seated at a remarkably plain desk that looked like it had been sourced from a mid-level accounting firm in Chicago, sat David Kessler. Kessler did not look like a hero. He did not look like a savior. At 58, he possessed a receding hairline, a slight paunch, and a gray, off-the-rack suit that stood in stark contrast to the bioluminescent displays and gilded robes of his adversaries. Before the war, Kessler hadn't been a soldier or a career diplomat. He had been a senior liquidator for a massive Wall Street hedge fund, a man who specialized in dissecting failing corporations, restructuring their debt, and bleeding them dry. When the United Nations Security Council realized that humanity was losing the Perseus armed conflict, they didn't promote another general. They drafted Kessler. The terms are absolute, Ambassador. Zarka's voice echoed through the chamber, translated by a neural implant into a booming patrician English. The Sol system will cede all orbital shipyards beyond the orbit of Mars. Your deep space mining operations in the Kuiper Belt will be transferred to Tavari oversight. The human military will be capped at 30 sublight patrol vessels. Furthermore, a planetary tax of 40 trillion galactic standard credits will be levied annually to pay for the damages your fleet inflicted upon the Krell border stations. Zarka leaned forward, his multifaceted eyes narrowing. You will sign this, or the combined armada currently holding position beyond your Old Cloud will commence orbital bombardment of your major population centers. We will start with Geneva, out of respect for your quaint historical traditions. Beside Kessler, his aide, Dr. Samantha Reed, tightened her grip on her datapad. Her knuckles were white. She was a systems analyst from MIT, thrust into the role of diplomatic attaché because most of the actual diplomats had been aboard the UNS Roosevelt when the Krell blasted 3 months ago. David, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The telemetry from the Deep Space Boys just updated. The Krell dreadnoughts are charging their plasma manifolds. They aren't bluffing. I know, Sam, Kessler murmured back, not breaking eye contact with Zarka. The chamber was silent, save for the low hum at the station's gravity generators. The council members watched the human. They expected defiance, perhaps a desperate plea for a grace period. They had seen it 100 times before, with 100 different nascent spacefaring species. The script was always the same. A young, ambitious race expands too fast, steps on the toes of the ancient powers, gets its fleet annihilated, and is subsequently forced into economic servitude. It was the natural order of the galaxy. Kessler slowly reached out and pulled the physical parchment toward him, a theatrical touch the Tavari insisted upon for surrenders. He picked up a heavy fountain pen. Then something strange happened. Arbiter Zarka, observing through his primary ocular nodes, noticed a micro-expression on the human's face. The corners of Kessler's mouth twitched upward. The musculature around his eyes contracted. He was smiling. It wasn't a smile of a broken man resigning himself to fate. It wasn't the hysterical grin of someone who had lost their mind to stress. It was a cold, quiet, predatory smile. It was the smile of a corporate raider who had just found a fatal loophole in a hostile takeover bid. Zarka felt a strange, illogical prickle of unease beneath his carapace. You find your subjugation amusing, Ambassador. Kessler put the pen down. He folded his hands together on the desk. Not at all, Arbiter Zarka. I was just reflecting on history. Specifically, human history. You see, when a war ends on Earth, the victor usually forces the loser to sign a treaty that destroys their economy. We had a famous one called the Treaty of Versailles. It didn't work out very well. It just guaranteed a much worse war a few decades later. There will be no worse war, human, scoffed the Krell representative, a massive brute whose vocal cords produced a sound like grinding stone. You have no ships left. You have no shipyards. You have nothing but your fragile blue world. True, Kessler conceded, his voice remarkably calm. General Thomas Harding and the United Earth Fleet gave you a hell of a fight, but we simply couldn't match your raw industrial output. You have thousands of automated foundry worlds. You have the Illyrium hyperlanes. Then you understand your position, Zaga said. Sign. I understand my position perfectly, Kessler replied. I'm just not entirely sure you understand yours. Kessler tapped his finger on the desk. You see, Arbiter, humanity learned a very painful lesson after the Battle of Sirius. We realized that in a conventional war of lasers, dreadnoughts, and shields, we are roughly 300 years behind you. We couldn't outbuild you. We couldn't outgun you. Kessler stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket. So the UN Security Council brought in people like me, people from the private sector. We took a step back and looked at the Galactic Council not as a military empire but as a multinational corporation. The VIA representative, an android avatar housing a collective artificial intelligence, spoke up, its voice a synthesized harmonic. Your analogy is flawed. We are a sovereign coalition governed by immutable laws of physics and economics. Exactly. Kessler pointed a finger at the VIA avatar. Economics. For the last 2 years, while our fleets were playing a highly publicized game of cat and mouse, losing ground inch by inch to keep your military distracted, humanity's real war effort was happening on a much quieter front. Kessler glanced at his watch, a vintage Rolex. It was currently 10:22 a.m. Earth Standard Time. He had 3 minutes. Arbiter Zarka, Kessler continued, pacing slightly. How exactly does the Council manage the logistics for an empire spanning 10,000 star systems? How do you ensure the Krell dreadnoughts get their plasma fuel? How do you feed the billion-citizen hive cities of Olaran? This is a delay tactic. The Krell representative slammed a heavy fist on the table. Cease this babble. We utilize the automated routing network, Zarka answered, his unease growing, though his voice remained flat. Governed by the central mainframes on Prime Station Aegis, contracted through the finest cybernetic minds in the quadrant. Contracted, Kessler repeated, tasting the word. That's the beauty of your society. You are so advanced, so old, and so wealthy that you outsource everything you consider menial, mining, refining, and even IT infrastructure maintenance. Kessler turned to Samantha. Dr. Reed, could you please remind the Council who won the bid to upgrade the firmware for the automated routing network last planetary cycle? Samantha swallowed hard, her fingers flying across her datapad. A consortium known as Vanguard Logistics, operating out of the neutral zone. They underbid the closest competitor by 40%. And who owns Vanguard Logistics? Kessler asked, turning back to the bewildered alien delegates. Zarka's mandibles clicked in irritation. It is a shell corporation of the Tyrian Syndicate, a neutral trading species. Long, Kessler said, the smile returning, wider this time. The Tyrian Syndicate was facing a catastrophic liquidity crisis 18 months ago. A private equity firm based in New York, BlackRock Interstellar. Let's call them, bailed them out. In exchange, humanity gained a controlling interest in Vanguard Logistics, to a labyrinth of proxies, blind trusts, and dummy corporations that would make a 20th century offshore banker blush. The United Nations of Earth owns the company that maintains your entire logistical network. Silence fell over the Grand Chamber. For a moment, the sheer audacity of the claim failed to compute in the alien minds. The Vir avatar's eyes flashed yellow. Impossible. Our security protocols are absolute. The Vanguard patch was thoroughly vetted by our AI watchdogs. Of course it was. Kessler nodded enthusiastically. And the patch was brilliant. It increased your routing efficiency by 12%. You even gave Vanguard a commendation. But you forgot one of the oldest rules of human warfare, dating back to a wooden horse in Tri and perfected in the late 20th century with a little piece of software called Stuxnet. Kessler placed both hands on the desk, leaning in. The air in the room felt suddenly heavy. The patch didn't contain a virus. A virus is messy, A virus gets caught. The patch contained a backdoor, disguised as a redundant diagnostic subroutine. For the last 6 months, humanity has had complete undetected administrative access to the Galactic Standard Credit Banking Network, the Illyrium refinery cooling systems, and the hyperlane navigation beacons. Zaka stood up, his massive frame towering over the desk. You are bluffing. No primitive species could bypass via cryptography. We didn't bypass it, Samantha spoke up, her voice suddenly steady, finding her courage. We just asked it nicely to open the door, and because we hold the administrative keys, it listened. Kessler checked his Rolex again. 10:25 a.m. Arbiter, Kessler said softly, you threatened to glass Geneva. I take that very personally. Before Zaka could respond, the Grand Chamber's ambient lighting flickered. A sharp, piercing klaxon began to wail, echoing off the chronal glass walls. The Krell representative let out a roar as his personal console erupted in red warning glyphs. My fleet, the navigation computers on the dreadnoughts in the Sol system. They are offline, they are drifting, the Oloran bureaucrat shrieked, clutching a data scroll. The Galactic Exchange, trillions of credits are evaporating. The central banking ledgers are overriding, all funds are being rerouted into decentralized void accounts. Zaka stared at the readouts cascading across his command pedestal. The numbers were catastrophic. Life support systems on agricultural worlds were dialing down to minimal. Automated supply freighters were dropping out of hyperspace in the middle of nowhere. The entire meticulously ordered infrastructure of the Galactic Council was seizing up like an engine suddenly drained of oil. Kessler remained perfectly still amidst the rising panic. He didn't gloat, he didn't shout. He simply watched the masters of the galaxy realize that the ground beneath their feet had just vanished. What have you done? Zaka demanded, his voice devoid of its former booming arrogance, reduced to a hollow rasp. I haven't fired a single shot, Kessler replied, picking up the heavy fountain pen and slipping it into his jacket pocket. But as of this exact second, your empire is paralyzed. Your dreadnoughts are floating tombs. Your banking system is bankrupt. If your agricultural worlds don't get the supply shipments we just halted, 3 trillion of your citizens will begin starving in exactly 14 days. Kessler pushed the surrender treaty back across the desk toward the towering alien. Now, the human ambassador said, pulling a new, surprisingly thick stack of paper from his briefcase. Let's talk about the new terms of our relationship. The air inside the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Assembly grew stagnant, thick with the metallic scent of Krell pheromones and the ozone tang of overheated Ver processing units. The invincible facade of the alien coalition had cracked, replaced by a desperate, scrambling panic. Arbiter Zaka stared at the thick stack of paper David Kessler had just slid across the table. It wasn't a treaty of surrender, it was a restructuring agreement. You cannot do this, Zaka hissed, his mandibles vibrating with suppressed rage. This is an act of galactic terrorism. We will isolate your vanguard subroutines. The Vi Collective will purge your primitive code from our mainframes. The Vir android avatar flickered, its optical sensors cycling rapidly through shades of distressed crimson. Arbiter, the synthesized harmonic voice was glitching, dropping an octave. We're attempting a system-wide quarantine. But the human code, it is not operating on standard chronological logic. It is predicting our countermeasures before we deploy them. It resembles the archaic, highly classified predictive algorithms developed by early human private intelligence firms. Something akin to the ancient Palantir Technologies databases, but scaled to a quantum level. They are routing our counter-hacks into infinite recursion loops, Doctor. Samantha Reed stated, her confidence blooming as she read the telemetry flowing into her datapad. Every time you try to lock us out, your security system locks down another one of your own vital functions. Right now, by trying to purge us, you just disabled the orbital traffic control over the Oloran homeworld. The Oloran representative, a slender, gray-skinned bureaucrat draped in heavy silks, let out a strangled gasp. 3,000 heavy freighters are currently in low orbit. If traffic control is blind, then you are going to have a very spectacular, very expensive meteor shower in about 20 minutes. Kessler interrupted, his tone chillingly conversational. He leaned back in his plane chair, steepling his fingers. Unless, of course, you stop trying to fight the inevitable and look at the new terms. General Gall, the hulking Krell military commander, slammed both fists onto the obsidian table, cracking the polished surface. I do not care about your financial tricks, human. I will manual override the flagship's command center. I will order my gunners to fire blindly into your planet's atmosphere until the oceans boil. Kessler didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He reached inside his jacket, a movement that caused the Tavari honor guards to raise their plasma rifles. Kessler ignored them, pulling out a small, heavy biometric silver fob. He placed it gently on the desk. "General Gall," Kessler said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Do you know what a dead man's switch is?" Gall paused, his secondary eyes narrowing. "A coward's tool. A businessman's insurance policy," Kessler corrected. "This fob is tied to my biometric signature. My heart rate, my body temperature, my neural activity. If I die, if my heart stops, or if I even fall unconscious from stress, this fob sends an encrypted hyperwave burst to the Vanguard mainframes. It initiates a protocol we call margin call." Kessler gestured to Samantha, who brought up a holographic projection in the center of the chamber. It displayed the glowing web of the Illyrium hyperlanes, the arteries of the Galactic Council's empire. "If margin call is activated," Kessler explained, pointing to the projection, "the cooling rods in every Illyrium refinery in the sector will be retracted. Simultaneously, the hyperlane gates will overload and detonate. It won't just destroy your fleet, General. It will sever your empire. Thousands of star systems will be plunged into the Dark Ages, isolated by millions of light-years of dead space. Your empire will shatter into 1,000 starving, warring factions before sunset." The chamber descended into a horrifying silence. The Tavari guards slowly, hesitantly lowered their weapons. "You are a monster," the Olaran delegate whispered, tears of thick black fluid pooling in his eyes. "You would sacrifice trillions of innocents." "I am a liquidator," Kessler replied coldly. "I was hired to prevent the liquidation of my own species. You came to our border, you burned our colonies, you blast our fleets, and you demanded we become your slaves. You set the rules of this hostile takeover council members. I am merely exploiting them." Sokka's towering frame seemed to shrink. The crimson ceremonial silk suddenly looked too large for his chitinous body. "What do you want?" Finally, Kessler sighed, unplicking his fountain pen. "A productive conversation. Dr. Reed, please bring up the financial ledgers for the Krell military-industrial complex." A new hologram flared to life, showing a staggering column of red, negative figures. "Over the past 3 centuries, the Krell have expanded the Council's borders using a heavily leveraged military structure," Kessler lectured, standing up and pacing around the desk like a professor addressing a failing class. "You borrowed trillions of galactic standard credits from the Olaran sovereign wealth funds to build those beautiful dreadnoughts parked outside my solar system. You promised to pay them back with the resources extracted from conquered worlds, like Earth. That is standard economic expansion," the Olaran murmured defensively. "It's a Ponzi scheme," Kessler snapped. "And it relies entirely on constant victory. But humans are stubborn. We didn't fold in 3 weeks like the others. We dragged this war out for 2 years. Your supply lines stretched, your fuel costs skyrocketed. The Krell defaulted on their interest payments 4 months ago." Sokka snapped his head toward the Krell general. "Is this true? You reported that the military budget was solvent." General Gall looked away, his jaw clenching. "We were anticipating the capture of the Sol system's asteroid belts to cover the shortfall." "Exactly." Kessler smiled, a sharp, predatory baring of teeth. "You were underwater, so Earth did what any smart investor does when they see a distressed asset. We bought your debt, the Ver Avatar spot." "Explain." "Through the Vanguard logistics shell companies and utilizing high-frequency trading algorithms modeled after the old JP Morgan Chase banking networks, humanity short-sold the Galactic Standard Credit," Kessler explained, enjoying the absolute bewilderment on the aliens' faces. "When you destroyed our 7th Fleet at the Battle of Sirius, your market surged in confidence. We bought the dip. We leveraged our own planet's future, packaged it into high-risk derivatives, and sold it back to your own Olaran bankers through blind trusts. We bought up every single defaulted Krell war bond." Kessler stopped pacing and planted his hands on the desk, leaning directly toward Arbiter Zaka. "We don't just control your logistical network, Arbiter. We own your mortgage. The Krell military doesn't belong to the Council anymore. By the laws of your own Galactic Banking Guild, the United Earth Security Council is now the majority shareholder of the Krell Armada." The revelation struck the Council members with the physical force of a kinetic orbital bombardment. The invincible 10,000-year-old bureaucratic machine of the Galactic Assembly ground to a horrifying halt, not because of a superweapon, but because of a margin call. General Gao, the towering Krell warlord whose name had terrified 100 species into submission, physically staggered backward. His massive clawed hands grasped at the ceremonial silver medals pinned across his broad chest, his secondary eyes wide with an emotion his species rarely experienced: absolute impotence. He realized with a sickening drop in his twin stomachs that the very armor he wore, the dreadnoughts his men commanded, and the plasma rifles of his honor guard now legally belonged to the unassuming gray-suited human standing before him. "This is completely invalid," Gal finally choked out, the station's translation matrix struggling to convey the sheer depth of his humiliation and rage. "A warrior's debt is paid in blood on the battlefield, human. It is not paid in ink on a ledger. I strongly suggest you read Section 4, Paragraph 12 of your own Galactic Banking Guild Charter." Kessler countered immediately, not missing a single beat. It didn't raise his voice. It didn't have to. The silence in the grand chamber was so profound that his calm baritone echoed like a judge's gavel. In the event of a sovereign entity's default, the holding institution assumes full, immediate command and control of all pledged collateral. Your ships, General, are the collateral. If you fire a single shot on Earth, or even scratch the paint on a human vessel, you are actively destroying human corporate property. I won't have you killed in battle, Gal. I will have you arrested for vandalism and sued for property damage. Arbiter Zaka sank heavily into his grand gilded chair. The crushing weight of his catastrophic failure was absolute. He had invited a bleeding lamb to the slaughter, fully expecting to dictate the terms of human extinction, only to discover the lamb was a corporate wolf infected with a terminal financial contagion. The Olran delegate, usually the master of galactic economics, was hyperventilating, his gray skin turning a sickly translucent white. "We have protocols. We can invoke Chapter 11 equivalent protections. The Central Bank of Olaran can freeze the assets. The Central Bank of Olaran is currently experiencing a severe liquidity crisis because Vanguard Logistics just paused all high-frequency trading subroutines," Dr. Mout. Samantha Reed stated, her eyes never leaving her datapad. "You can't freeze assets you no longer have access to. Every digital vault on your homeworld is currently locked by a rolling biometric encryption key that only Ambassador Kessler possesses." "What are your terms?" Zaka asked. His booming patrician voice was gone, reduced to a hollow, defeated rasp that sounded like dry leaves scraping across stone. "You have crippled our vital infrastructure. You have stolen our military. What is left for a primitive species to demand?" "I'm not here to destroy the Council," Kessler said, his tone shifting from aggressive negotiation to coldly professional management. He adjusted his cuffs, perfectly at ease. "Total destruction is terrible for long-term business. Earth wants to integrate into the galactic community, but we will integrate as the board of directors, not as the indentured janitorial staff." Kessler reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second, much thicker document, tapping it against the obsidian desk. "These are the articles of incorporation for the newly formed Terran Galactic Syndicate. Let's review the restructuring. Article 1. The Sol system, and a 50 light-year radius surrounding it, is recognized as a sovereign, untaxed economic zone. You will not station a single vessel within our borders without submitting a tariff request to the United Nations Securities and Exchange Commission." Gore let out a low, mournful growl, his fists clenching, but he did not move toward his weapon. Vanguard's administrative keys had already overridden his command codes. He was a general without an army. "Article 2, Kessler continued, his eyes briefly flicking to the Krell commander. "All Krell dreadnoughts and heavy cruisers will be immediately retrofitted. You are no longer a military armada, General Gal. You are now the heavy-lift commercial cargo division of Earth's Merchant Marine. I hope your elite shock troopers are ready to haul Illyrium freight and agricultural supplies. Because you have a staggering amount of corporate debt to work off over the next 3 centuries. You would turn the greatest warriors in the cosmos into delivery drivers, Gal whispered, thoroughly broken. Amazon did it back home. It's a very lucrative model, Kessler noted dryly. Article 3, the Galactic Standard Credit is hereby dissolved. The reserve currency of the galaxy is now pegged directly to the United States dollar, overseen by the Federal Reserve in Washington. If the Olaran Hive cities wish to print money to fund their social programs, you will request an audit and permission from human bankers. And what of my people? Sarkar asked, his multifaceted eyes dimming as he looked down at his own clawed hands. What of the Tavari Directorate? We are the political leaders of this entire council. Kessler offered a slow, merciless smile. It was the absolute manifestation of hard karma. You were the political leaders of a bankrupt subsidiary, Sarkar. Under Article 4, you are personally held liable for the gross mismanagement of council assets during the Perseus Arm conflict. You are hereby stripped of your title as arbiter. Your ancestral estates, your private fleet, and your offshore accounts in the neutral zone are being seized to pay down the interest on the Krell war bonds. Sarkar's claws dug violently into the armrests of his chair, tearing the ancient embroidered fabric. You would humiliate me before the entire galaxy? You would leave me a beggar in the streets of my own capital. I am simply liquidating your unearned authority, Sarkar, Kessler said softly, leaning forward. You tried to force humanity to its knees. You threatened to burn Geneva to ashes for the sake of your own vanity and profit margins. This isn't humiliation, this is an audit. Kessler pushed the new punishing treaty forward across the desk, setting his heavy silver fountain pen beside it. Sign the paperwork, Sarkar. Transfer the executive rights to Earth. Turn the power back on for your agricultural worlds. Save trillions of your people from the starvation you almost caused. Or don't, and I let Margin Core run its course, plunging 10,000 worlds into the Dark Ages. The choice is yours. You have exactly 60 seconds. The Grand Chamber was dead silent. The only sound in the vast imposing room was the frantic mechanical ticking of Kessler's vintage Rolex. The master of the galaxy, the chitinous warlord who had conquered 100 worlds and broken 1,000 species, looked at the small, grey-haired human from Earth. He searched for an ounce of mercy or hesitation in Kessler's eyes, but found only a bottomless, calculating abyss. With trembling claws, Sarkar picked up the pen. He did not bother to read the rest of the terms. He knew he had lost everything. He signed his name, the scratching of the nib sealing the unconditional surrender of a 10,000-year-old empire to a species that had only figured out faster-than-light travel 3 centuries ago. Samantha Reed let out a shaky breath she felt she had been holding for an eternity. Her datapad flashed a brilliant green. The Vanguard network was officially accepting the new overarching parameters. The most hostile corporate takeover in the history of the universe was complete. Kessler calmly retrieved his pen, wiped the nib, capped it, and placed the signed treaty carefully into his briefcase. He snapped the brass locks shut, the sharp click echoing loudly in the quiet, defeated room. "It has been a genuine pleasure doing business with you," Kessler said, buttoning his off-the-rack jacket and turning his back on the broken masters of the Galactic Council. As Kessler and Reed walked out through the massive chronal glass doors, leaving the alien delegates sitting in the absolute ruins of their own pride and economy, Kessler pulled out an encrypted comlink. "New York," Kessler said into the device, his voice steady and calm. "The merger is complete. Tell the boys at Goldman Sachs to open the markets. We own the galaxy." In the end, the Galactic Council learned that wars are not won solely with plasma cannons and dreadnoughts. They are won with ledgers, leverage, and the cold, calculating nature of human economics. Earth didn't conquer the stars with fire. They bought them at a discount. Ambassador Kessler returned home not as a conquering general, but as the supreme auditor of a newly acquired, heavily indebted, and entirely human-owned galaxy.